One thing you have to be aware of is that the modelling compound will dry at different rates depending on how much of the snow material that you've put in, the Woodland Scenic snow stuff. Hello and welcome to this final video in the series, painting up Kings of War, Shadows in the North, the 2-player starter set by Mantic Games. Today we're going to multi-base up the Northern Alliance. We're going for a snowy, icy theme, and we're going to start with the Snow Troll bases. So ignore those few multi-bases at the front there. Those were for the Night Stalkers, but they're just still on the desk while I was working on the Northern Alliance bases. Going to start by gluing down a couple of pieces of slate in the corners after we've worked out roughly where we want the models to be on the base. So that's what you want to do to start with, work out where the models are going to go, because you know they've got their arms hanging out to the side. You kind of need to know where they're going to sit, and I'll often sort of just draw on the base where the feet are going to go. Now the idea of the pieces of slate is that they provide like a natural overhang, so it's going to be like not a cliff, but like some small rock overhang, where underneath that overhang there'll be some snow and ice, and on top of it is where the models are going to stand. They also provide some height on the base, which adds a lot of interest. I'm going to use Milliput to work around the stones, even them off, and provide a bit more height at the back of the base. Just using the tool, wet the tool so that it slides on the Milliput nicely, and work around softening down the Milliput where you want it to sort of settle down, and trying to make a fairly square side and back to the multi-base, so that, you know, when you're displaying them or if you're playing the game, you don't have other bases that can't bump up nicely square to it. Now here's a base that I'd already started for the infantry models, and it's a bit rough on the back, so just using some Milliput to square off the back edge, and then we're going to sand it down on some wet and dry paper. It doesn't produce a completely perfectly flat surface. The Milliput's quite hard. You need to go at it for quite a while on the wet and dry. You could spend a bit longer if you wanted and get it perfectly flat on the back by just sort of rebuilding in layers of Milliput and going back in with the sanding, but I kind of got it like reasonably square, and that's fine for me. You can see with the infantry bases that I've also used some cork underneath the slate to provide some additional height. Now I made a slight error with these infantry bases in that they were meant to be two troop bases that could be stuck together, but if you watch my Night Stalker video, you'll know that with regards to these Northern Alliance troop bases, infantry troop bases, I accidentally stuck the slate over the join, so there's no way that I could cut it, so I'm kind of just sticking with these being regiment bases now. Now, underneath the slate areas where there's like rocky overhang, that's where you'd want sort of like larger stones. So we're going to mix up some PVA. It's like a strong hobby PVA. Mix it up with a little bit of water to thin it down, but not much. And we're going to put some heavier grain, coarser sand around the bottom of those sort of rocky cliff outcroppings. I keep saying cliffs, they're not really cliffs. If you were doing like a 15mm model army, then they would be scaled like, you know, small cliffs, but these are kind of just sort of like rock outcroppings that the models would be walking over. You know, 38mm models, they would just be walking over these. So we're going to thin down the PVA a little bit more, just to get more out of it and to spread it around so that it's not too thick. And we're just going to sprinkle more sand all over the base here, you know, a mixture of different grains. We don't want it to be too uniform. Near enough all this is going to get covered up by the snow effect that we're going to apply, but we want it to be on there so that if there's areas where the snow isn't showing, it's going to look good. And if you wanted a base that was like more patchy snow, you definitely want to have this like mixed grain on the base to start with, so that it shows through the areas where you don't cover it with snow. You'll notice that I'm leaving some areas at the front of the bases a little bit free of the sand and the grit. That's where we're going to put the kind of like icy effect a little bit later. Now, there's nearly always a few patches where you want to go back in once the sand and the PVA is dried, just to sort of fill in any gaps. Going to give this a real heavy coating of primer now. Just once it's dry, that is. Give it a real heavy coating of primer just to kind of seal everything in and make sure the paint that we applied to it is going to going to adhere properly. Going with black here, even though it's going to be a snow base, this isn't the snow. This is the earth underneath, and it's going to be rocky. And to paint the underlying rocks, we're just going to gradually dry brush it up through grey into almost white, starting with some Vallejo cold grey. Real nice mid-grey, kind of like a Games Workshop Codex grey. So I prefer to have the dry brush very, very slightly damp. Just makes it not quite so chalky when you put it on, but it does also mean that you're kind of doing more of a somewhere between a dry brush and an overbrush, but that's totally fine in my point of view. From my point of view, that's totally fine for bases. It doesn't have to be like perfectly crisp edge highlights. I can't even remember exactly which colours I use on this, to be honest, but we're just going up from greys towards whites. So if you've got something like a Codex or a cold grey or something like that, just add a bit more white into it at each step. I'm using a really cheapo makeup brush here, and it's not as good as like a proper dry brush from a normal games company, but they're so cheap. Personally for me, I think they're a better option. Certainly for basing anyway, rather than models. You don't want to be knackering up a really decent dry brush on basing. Going in here with a load of black Templar over the rocky areas. Just provides some extra definition and blends in all that dry brushing that we did. And also like under the overhangs, because we want that to look really dark afterwards. It's going to be in shadow. Wyldewood now to just provide some shading across pretty much everything else on the base. You can thin it down a little bit, but I wouldn't thin it down too much, and if you thin it down, use the contrast medium if you can. One of my favourite paints here, some Deneb stone. Just a quick dry brush to bring the bring some highlights back into the rocks here. Not just the outcropping rocks, the slate pieces, but across the whole of the base. If you didn't want to go for a snow base, this is quite a nice sort of like rocky desert, sort of desolate desert sort of theme. You could the snow mixture that we're going to use shortly. You could apply that much more sparsely and just have a kind of like a melted snow look, really, where there's just some bits of snow left over. So we're just going to prepare the area that's going to be kind of like an ice field. I know it's like at the front of all the bases, and sometimes that doesn't always look great, but for these multi-basing projects, you kind of want the fun part of the base really to be visible from the front, even though it's not particularly realistic that all the models would just happen to be walking in an area where there was ice in front of them. So we're going in with the dark sea blue at the front there, and while it's still wet, basically we're kind of sort of stippling it in front of the part that we painted with the dark sea blue. The sea blue is still a little bit wet, so we're just sort of like mixing it in on the model. You got to be quite quick with this because it will. You can see that it's still a little bit wet, but obviously it's on top of, even though it's been primed, it's on top of basically MDF, so it is going to soak in reasonably quickly. And you don't have to be too precise here. You can see it's kind of like just get it on. It's thinned down, probably about 1 part water to 1 part paint. Just kind of like get it on. You want it to be you want it to be sort of like mixed. You want the two colours to sort of mix into each other. They can be jaggedy. Don't be too precious about getting perfect blends at this point. Going in with some of the sky blue right on the edge of the rocky bit, so this would be the most shallow part of the water that has iced over. I mentioned earlier about how these would look if you were doing like a smaller scale army on these, and this would look like a, you know, really, this would be a really good technique for doing like a coastline if you were doing like 15mm models on here. You know, that's quite a nice quick shallow coastline sort of done and dusted there, really. Just getting a bit of the electric blue thinned down, probably sort of 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part paint, and just using it as a glaze to kind of mix in everything that we, not mix, to sort of like glaze over everything we've done so far and blend it in a little bit. And that's it really, in terms of that painting. I'm happy with that, nice gradient. I'm going to use the UV resin method that I've done a separate little video for, so you can watch that other video if you want a bit more details about my resin tests. I'm keeping this part in the video with this little rig that I've set up. What you're going to find a little bit later is that it was actually a mistake to set it up in a rig like that with the spare bits of MDF holding the resin in, and you'll see why in a minute. On the rest of the bases, I don't do that. I just go back and forward with the resin. It's quite thick. It won't fall off the edge of the base if you're careful. You don't want to end up having to put 2 layers of resin on. If you watch my previous video, you'll see why. So just carefully, without sort of bubbling up the resin, just using a cocktail stick to just make it flow to the edge of the base, but not over. Like I said, it's got quite a high surface tension, so it doesn't flow over the edge of the base. Now it's UV curing resin, so we just use the lamp to cure it. And then what I did was stuck it on the windowsill in the daytime for another couple of hours to make sure it was like cured all the way through. Now this isn't meant to be like a pool of water. It's meant to be ice, so we're going to scratch it up with some wet and dry paper. And then I'm going to scratch it up further with the blade here. Again, I got to do a shout out to Goblins Den Studio. It's a channel with only 1 video at the time of recording this video here, like an ice basing tutorial. And I took quite a bit of inspiration from that video. So if you go and watch theirs, you'll sort of see what I'm talking about. I do things a little bit differently, but you know, real good inspiration from that. And yeah, here you can see why that was a problem, putting that rig around the edge of the base. The resin butted up against it and produced an effect that I didn't want. Now, if you wanted to produce that effect, that's how you do it, but I'm having to snip off that bit of resin at the front, which isn't ideal. But we can kind of hide the mistake by scratching it up a bit. So here's the ingredients for our snow. We got sort of like thick modelling paste, white paint, Woodland Scenics snow effect, like granules. I'm just going to sort of mix those up, and you'll see the sort of amounts that I'm putting in. Also going to put a tiny little drop of blue paint in because we don't want it to yellow, and it's you know, it's kind of like a snowy Arctic theme we're going for here. So we want it to be very, very slightly blue. If it's going to be any color other than white, I want it slightly blue. Now, I want this snow to be really thick. I want it like they're walking over a really kind of like thick snowfield, basically, where there's just a few outcroppings of rock and a little bit of ice to make it more interesting. Now I'm going to try a couple of different ways of seating the models into this mixture and onto these bases. Some are more successful than others, so sort of watch throughout the rest of the video and you'll sort of see what I'm talking about. Now, in hindsight, I probably should have tried to pin these guys to the base. The reason I didn't was because of the slate. I knew that I wouldn't be able to pin them into the slate. And I knew that the modelling compound was going to be sticky once it was dry. So I thought, I'm just going to go for an approach where we effectively like glue them onto the base into the snow. These are big models, you know, big snow trolls. They're going to sort of like, as they're walking through and they're punching their fists down into the snow, they're going to sink in a bit, so I thought that was totally fine. You can see though that they're not settling, they're not sort of sitting into the base and staying there. It's not like a glue that glues really quickly. This stuff dries hard over time, so you kind of need to balance stuff against them so that they don't keep falling over. Just make sure they're in the right place. And then we sprinkle on some Woodland Scenic Snow on top, just to sort of finish off the look, and sprinkle more of it on if you want it to look like more powdery snow. Now, as I speeded up the process of attaching the infantry models here, you can really see what I mean by them sort of falling over and moving around. So you've got to be patient if you're going with this approach, and I think if you want a really thick, luscious snow covering, it's probably the best way to do it, rather than trying to like pin them to the base and work the snow around the feet. Now, I think it looks, you know, pretty good. I feel like they're walking on top of the snow. Now, these guys I am going to pin to the front of the base because they're going to be on the ice, so there won't be snow on their feet, sort of gluing them on. So we're going to just use some actual super glue here, and if the super glue ends up frosting around their feet, that's totally fine because you know, they're walking on ice anyway. Now, what I'm indicating here is that these guys look a little bit ranked up, like, you know, 4 rows of 4. Not quite 4 rows of 4, but you see what I mean. And with these guys, they're much more sort of like all over the place, which I like a lot better, and that's due to the way that I designed the bases. The one where they look too ranked up, it was really a fault of making the underlying base like basically stepped, so that the back end was higher, then there was a lower middle area, then a lower again front area. Cocked this up a bit here. I wasn't paying attention to the arms of the models, so I can't really put these two bases together very well without like snipping off some snipping off some spears, which I don't want to do. Now, once dried, those models were pretty well glued in, if you like, through the modelling compound hardening around their feet, but I did need to leave it for almost 24 hours for it to work properly. Now, I'm going to try a different approach with these like snow wolf things here. Snow foxes, sorry. I'm going to glue them to the base first and then work around the feet. A couple of reasons for that. Firstly, I wanted to see what it was like and sort of, you know, document that, you know, see if it produces a more sturdy result. And secondly, they've kind of got they've got like a molded on part of ground on their feet, so I kind of needed to do it like that to cover it up. What I found is it's kind of easier to work around the models when they're glued in to a certain degree. Like with the snow foxes, there's loads of room around them, but if you try to do that with the infantry models, it'll be really hard to work around and get the snow around their feet, like on the middle of the base here where there's loads of models. I just don't know if it would have been possible. What I'm doing with the toothpick here, with a bit of the snow that's left over, is just going around and trying to hide any areas where maybe the feet push the snow out the way and it doesn't look right. So just trying to sort of mold it in and make it look good. One thing you have to be aware of is that the modelling compound will dry at different rates depending on how much of the snow material that you put in, the Woodland Scenic Snow stuff. So I definitely recommend doing a little tester of how quick stuff dries, especially if you're going to use the snowy compound mixture to end up gluing the models in. And we're just seeing a few sort of final shots here of what everything looks like, you know, fully based up with a bit of a scenic backdrop. You know, I think it looks pretty good. Like I said, I've gone for like a real thick snow. I think it, you know, doesn't look yellow. I hope it doesn't yellow over time. I don't think it will, because I mixed in a lot of white paint and a little bit of blue paint. Oh yeah, by the way, I mixed in some cheapo white paint, which isn't quite as white, but it's cheap. I mixed in some like proper model color white paint as well to make it more white. Anyway, you know, let me know what you think about the final result. If you found the video useful, give us a like, give us a comment, let us know if you've done a similar project, if you do anything differently. And yeah, thanks for watching.